Every so often, a book appears that readers are almost afraid to recommend, not because of what it forbids, but because of what it dares to claim. For 100 years, a slim, quietly written little manual has circulated in secret among the successful and the desperate alike, each swearing it changed something they could not explain. Some call it a curiosity. Others call it dangerous. A few refuse to discuss it at all. Its claim is this, that the world you touch is only an echo of a world you cannot see, a world built from thought, word, and expectation, and that most people are the architects of it without ever knowing they hold the tools. Right now, we open that hidden architecture. We will walk through the scribe's chamber where the unseen mind keeps its ledger. Chapter 1. The Weaver Beneath the World. Long before the pyramids rose from the sand, the old priesthoods of the Nile taught that every soul carried an unseen weaver within it. Not a loom of thread, but a loom of thought. They said this weaver never sleeps, never argues, and never refuses an instruction. It simply weaves whatever pattern it is shown, day after day, until the pattern becomes cloth, and the cloth becomes a life. A young apprentice once complained to his teacher that his family had always been poor and always would be. The teacher asked him a single question. "What pattern have you been handing the weaver?" The boy did not understand. So the teacher explained, "The weaver beneath the world does not judge whether a picture is wanted or feared. It only weaves what is shown to it most often, most vividly, with the most feeling behind it. A man who pictures loss, even while begging for wealth, is still handing the weaver a picture of loss." There is a second account of a young dyer's apprentice in the same temple workshops. As a joke among the older craftsmen, she was assigned for one full season to dye every cloth that passed through her hands the deep black reserved for mourning. To teach patience, they told her, laughing. She grew so used to the motion, the shade, the smell of that single dye, that years later, long after she had become a master dyer free to choose any color she wished, her hand kept drifting back to the same black vat whenever she was distracted or unsure. It took her deliberate, sustained effort to teach her hands a new color, one motion at a time, until the old groove finally wore smooth and a new one took its place. The weaver, the old craftsman said afterward, was simply given a pattern longer than anyone intended, and it did not know to stop weaving it on its own.
Hindu teachers, describing what they called chitta, the substance of the mind itself, arrived at a nearly identical picture, a mind stuff that takes the shape of whatever impression is repeatedly pressed into it, the way water takes the shape of its container, and holds that shape long after the container has changed. Modern study of the mind describes something remarkably similar, a layer beneath conscious thought that stores repeated impressions and quietly directs behavior long before the reasoning mind is even aware a decision has been made. What the old teachers called a weaver, current understanding might simply call a well-worn groove, but the underlying observation is the same. Repetition, not willpower alone, is what carves the deepest channels. This is why so many traditions insisted the discipline was never a single dramatic decision made once and trusted to hold. It was a daily correction, small and unglamorous, repeated exactly as often as the old pattern had been. The ancients called it the unseen weaver. The names have changed. The loom has not. There is a further teaching, quieter than the rest, that the temple priesthoods reserved for their more advanced students. The weaver, they said, cannot be reasoned with directly, the way one reasons with a person. It cannot be argued into a new pattern through a single clear explanation of why the old one no longer serves. It can only be shown, patiently and repeatedly, a replacement pattern, clear enough and felt strongly enough that it eventually overtakes the old one through sheer volume of impression rather than through argument. This is why the old teachers so distrusted the merely clever solution, the trick of logic meant to talk the mind out of an old fear in a single sitting. The weaver does not listen to clever arguments. It only ever listens to what keeps being shown to it, morning after morning, whether or not the showing feels significant at the time. Ask yourself plainly, what have you been asking your own weaver to make without ever meaning to ask for it? The pattern shown carelessly becomes cloth all the same. The pattern shown with intention becomes something worth wearing.
Chapter 2. The Word that Wakes the World. In the oldest writings pressed into Sumerian clay, the gods do not build the world with their hands, they speak it. To name a thing, in that ancient understanding, was to call it into existence. A student once asked an old temple scribe why so much care was taken over a single word carved into a tablet. The scribe replied that a careless word, once spoken aloud, could not be recalled. It had already gone to do its work in the world, whether the speaker wished it or not. There is an old account of two merchants trading in the same market. One, whenever a deal soured, declared, "I always lose on these ventures." The other, facing the very same misfortunes, would only say, "This one taught me the terms for the next." Years passed, one merchant's caravan shrank, cautious and joyless. The other's grew, not because his luck was better, but because he kept approaching each new trader with the confidence of a man who expected to learn something useful, rather than the caution of a man who expected to be cheated again. Neither man controlled the market. Both, without realizing it, had been quietly instructing it, and instructing themselves in how to move through it. A second account comes from an old village custom far to the east, where households carved short blessings into the wooden posts flanking their doorways each new year, and were careful never to carve a complaint or a curse there, however tempting, since the posts were believed to keep repeating silently whatever had been fixed into them. One household, in a bitter season, carved a line of pure resentment into their post rather than wait for a calmer week. Neighbors noticed, within the year, that the same household seemed to attract one petty dispute after another, as though the doorway itself kept quietly repeating the grievance to everyone who passed beneath it. The Stoic philosophers, centuries later and a continent away, arrived at a closely related teaching. It is never the event itself which shapes a man, they said, but the judgment he pronounces over it, and a judgment spoken aloud, repeated, hardens into a belief the mind will defend long after the original evidence has faded. Speech, in every one of these traditions, was never considered idle. It was considered a tool being used, for better or worse, in every waking hour, whether the speaker meant to be using it or not. An old Sumerian instruction given to young scribes on their first day of training has survived in fragments across several tablets, worded slightly differently each time, but carrying the same warning. A scribe, it said, is not merely a recorder of what has already happened. A careless scribe, through a badly chosen word, can quietly begin recording what has not happened yet. And every person, whether trained in the craft or not, carries on their tongue the same dangerous instrument the scribes were taught to handle with such deliberate care. The instruction was never to speak less. It was to speak the way a careful scribe writes, aware that the word, once released, becomes part of the permanent record, whether the speaker intended it to or not. What have you declared about yourself today, without noticing you were building anything at all? Choose the word before the word chooses your day for you.
Chapter 3. The Reed That Would Not Break. Along the banks of the Nile, the great cedars of the north were once brought in for temple beams, prized for their strength. But when the yearly flood came roaring down from the highlands, it was not the mighty cedar that survived on the riverbank. It was the humble papyrus reed. The reed stood rigid against the current, and the current, given no other option, tore it from the earth, roots and all, and carried it downstream. The reed simply bent flat beneath the water, let the flood pass entirely over it, and rose again once the river had returned to its bed, unbroken and barely marked. A young builder once asked why the temple architects still favored reed paper for sacred records instead of harder materials. An old craftsman answered, "Because what bends outlives what only resists." A second story, carried by desert traders far to the east, describes a lone acacia tree that stood alone on an exposed ridge for 100 years of desert storms, while the taller, straighter trees planted in its shelter eventually snapped or toppled one by one. Travelers who studied it noticed its trunk had grown slightly twisted, never in one fixed line, always adjusting a few degrees with each season's prevailing wind. It was not the strongest tree on the ridge. It was simply the one that never insisted on facing the wind exactly the same way twice. This has been observed far beyond Egypt and the desert routes. Taoist teachers, watching water wear down stone over centuries without ever striking it in anger, called it the strength of yielding, and taught that the softest thing in the world could, given enough time, overtake the hardest. Stoic teachers, standing in a very different climate, taught their students to sort the world into what could be controlled and what could not, and to stop wasting strength fighting the second category entirely, no matter how unjust it felt to let it go unchallenged. None of these traditions were preaching surrender to injustice, and none of them were preaching passivity dressed up as wisdom. They were describing a far stranger kind of power, the power of ceasing to fight what genuinely cannot be fought, so that all remaining strength can be spent on what actually can. There is a quiet cost to constant resistance that rarely gets named directly. A person spending all his strength
holding a position against an unmovable current, has none left over for the ordinary, patient work of adapting, rerouting, or simply continuing forward by another path. Where in your life right now are you standing like the cedar when the reed's posture would let the flood simply pass? It is worth naming plainly what non-resistance is not, since the word invites easy misunderstanding. It is not an agreement that a wrong is right, and it is not the silence of a person too tired or too frightened to speak. The reed does not pretend the flood is gentle. It simply declines to spend its strength proving a point to a current that has no interest in the argument. There is a kind of fighting that changes an outcome, and a kind that only exhausts the one doing the fighting, while the outcome remains exactly as it was. The old teachers asked their students to learn carefully and honestly which kind of fight they were actually in before spending themselves on it. The tree that only insists eventually breaks. The tree that keeps adjusting is still standing, season after season. Chapter 4. The Wheel Remembers. An old teaching from the banks of the Ganges compares a man's life to a great wheel turning slowly, carrying forward everything placed upon it, whether he remembers placing it there or not. There is a story of two brothers who inherited a single well between them. One, in a season of plenty, drew more water than his share, and let his brother's fields go thirsty without a second thought, telling himself it was simply good fortune that the well ran in his favor that year. Years turned, the well shifted its flow, as wells sometimes do, and it was now the second brother's land that overflowed with water, and the first brother's fields that dried and cracked. Neither brother remembered the wheel had been turning the whole time, quietly carrying forward an account neither of them had thought to keep. A second account belongs to the temple courts of the old Nile kingdoms, where every soul upon death was said to stand before a great scale. Upon one side rested the heart, on the other a single feather, representing the natural order of truth and balance. A heart carrying too much unaddressed weight, the old teaching held, could not rest level with the feather, no matter how the scales were adjusted afterward. The only preparation that mattered was the weighing a person did honestly upon themselves long before that final scale was ever reached. This is not, in the oldest versions of the teaching, a story of punishment handed down from above. The teaching is more precise than that. Whatever a man sends outward returns to him, not as a penalty assigned by a distant judge, but simply as a wheel completing a circle it was always going to complete, or a scale settling to whatever weight was actually placed upon it. And yet, in nearly every tradition that describes this wheel, there is also a teaching of release. Buddhist teachers spoke of a debt that could be dissolved through a change of heart rather than only repaid through further suffering, describing forgiveness less as a favor granted to someone else and more as a technical adjustment to the wheel itself, lifting weight that no longer needed to keep turning. Forgiveness, in this old teaching, was described as a hand reaching directly into the wheel and lifting the weight straight out of it, before it has the chance to turn again and complete its circle. There is a teaching, common to several of these traditions in different phrasing, that the wheel turns most reliably not through dramatic acts, but through small, repeated ones, scarcely noticed at the time. An unkind word muttered under the breath, a debt quietly resented rather than settled, a small unfairness excused because correcting it seemed like too much trouble. It is rarely the single large offense that a person struggles to trace back to its source later in life. It is the accumulated weight of 100 small unexamined ones, each too minor to seem worth the wheel's attention, until together they are not minor at all. There is a further teaching worth adding here, since the wheel is easily misunderstood as a purely punishing mechanism. The same wheel, the elders insisted, carries forward kindness with exactly the same reliability it carries forward harm. A small, unremarked generosity, repeated often enough, tends to return in forms the giver could never have specifically requested or predicted, arriving from directions that trace back to the original kindness with some effort if they can be traced at all. The wheel, in this fuller understanding, was never simply a ledger of debts. It was a ledger of everything, weighted exactly as heavily toward good as it was toward harm. A wheel remembers everything placed upon it, but a hand can still reach in and set something down.
The Weightless Yoke. There is an old account of a porter who carried goods for the merchant caravans crossing the high passes. Each evening, before the shrine at the roadside, he would set his pack down at the threshold, rest through the night, and pick it up again fresh at dawn, as every porter before him had always done. One evening, exhausted and behind schedule, he decided to keep the pack strapped to his back through the night, rather than lose the time of unstrapping and restrapping it. He told himself it would save effort, and that one night surely made no difference either way. He did not sleep. The weight that had felt manageable all day became unbearable the moment he tried to rest beneath it without setting it down even once, and by morning he was more exhausted than if he had walked through the night instead. A second account comes from the earliest Christian hermits living alone in the desert caves of Egypt in the centuries just after the old temples had begun to empty. One young monk, overwhelmed by a recurring fear he could not shake, confessed to an elder that he had been silently wrestling with it every night for months, certain wrestling harder would eventually win the fight outright. The elder told him simply, "You are trying to carry water in your two clenched fists. Open your hands and hand the water to something wider than your grip." The younger monk began instead repeating a short handful of words each night, not fighting the fear directly, but naming it plainly and handing it elsewhere before sleep. Within weeks, the fear had lost most of its grip on his nights, though nothing in his outward circumstances had changed at all. Only the posture of his mind toward the fear had shifted. The teachers who told both stories, a continent and centuries apart, were not speaking only of packs strapped to a back or fears rehearsed in the dark. They meant every burden a mind carries without ever laying it down, a grievance revisited constantly, a worry rehearsed on a loop long after any new decision could be made from rehearsing it further, a debt turned over and over, though nothing new is being decided by the turning. The old instruction was simple
and deliberately unspectacular. The burden may need to be picked up again in the morning, but it does not need to be carried without pause through every hour in between. Set it down at some threshold, however brief that pause might be. Let something wider than 2 hands hold it, even for a few hours. The desert hermits kept a further observation worth carrying forward, one that many later students of the mind would arrive at again on their own. A burden set down is rarely gone for good the first time. It tends to be picked back up out of habit long before it is needed again, sometimes within the very same hour it was set down. This was never treated as failure. It was treated as the ordinary shape of the practice. Set it down, notice it has been picked back up, set it down again, without frustration at the repetition. The way a hand relearning a new grip on a familiar tool must simply keep correcting itself until the new grip becomes the natural one. What have you been gripping tightly tonight that was only ever meant to be set down, if only for a while? Chapter 6. The Lion That Was Never There. Caravan guards crossing the desert routes at night grew used to a particular sound just past the edge of the firelight, a low shifting in the dark that every new recruit swore was a lion circling the camp. One young guard, terrified through his first several nights on watch, was finally handed a torch by an older guard and told to walk directly toward the sound instead of away from it, however much every instinct argued against the idea. He found, at the end of a short walk, nothing more than a loose tent rope dragging against dry brush in the wind. He returned to the fire, shaken but oddly lighter, and slept soundly for the first time in a week. The sound never troubled him again, though it continued exactly as before every following night. The old guards had a saying for it, repeated to every new recruit in turn. The lion takes its size from the distance you keep from it. A second account tells of a young official terrified of a formal audience he had been summoned to, certain for weeks beforehand that he would be humiliated or dismissed the moment he stood before the court. He rehearsed every possible disaster so many times in his mind that the actual audience, when it finally arrived, felt almost anticlimactic by comparison, brief, ordinary, and entirely survivable. He remarked afterward that he had clearly spent far more suffering on the imagined event than the real one had ever required of him. Stoic teachers made nearly this exact observation their central practice, insisting that a mind rehearsing catastrophe in vivid detail suffers the catastrophe in full, whether or not the catastrophe itself ever arrives, and that far more of a person's dread is manufactured privately than is ever delivered by the world outside. The old instruction was never to pretend danger does not exist. It was to stop feeding an imagined danger more detail and dread than the real one, should it ever actually appear, would deserve. There is a further distinction worth making plain, since it is easy to blur under the strain of genuine fear. Some dangers do warrant caution, careful preparation, and real respect. The old teachers were not describing those. They were describing the far larger category of things dreaded at length that never arrive at all, or that arrive so much smaller than imagined that the dread spent on them turns out, in hindsight, to have been the greater cost by far. A guard who checks the dark for genuine threats is being sensible. A guard who spends every night rigid with a fear he has never once tested is spending a currency he can never get back. What sound at the edge of your firelight have you been circling for weeks rather than simply walking toward it once, torch in hand?
Chapter 7. The Unarmed Heart. In the old teaching stories of the Middle Way, there is an account of a healer who tended the sick in a village where a rival healer worked as well, and worked hard, deliberately and often, to see her fail. The rival spread doubt about her methods among the townspeople, turned patients away from her door with quiet warnings, and delighted openly whenever her efforts did not succeed as hoped. One evening, the rival fell seriously ill himself, and no one else in the village would agree to treat him, given how openly he had worked against her for so long. He arrived, humiliated and afraid, at the healer's own threshold, with nowhere else left to turn. She treated him through the night, with the same care she gave every other patient who came to her door, without a single word of the harm he had caused her over the years. He recovered fully. He never spoke against her again, and in time became unexpectedly her strongest advocate in the village, telling anyone who would listen what kind of person she really was. A second account tells of a Stoic teacher whose lectures were mocked publicly year after year by a rival philosopher determined to draw a crowd at his expense. The teacher greeted the man with unfailing courtesy whenever they crossed paths, answered his taunts with plain, unhurried respect, and never once in front of students or strangers returned the insult in kind. Years later, it was the rival, worn down by his own unanswered hostility, who quietly began attending the teacher's lectures himself, and eventually became one of his most devoted students, admitting that he had never understood why kindness he could not provoke had unsettled him more than any argument ever could. The teachers who preserved both stories were careful to explain what this quality was not. It was not weakness, and it was not blindness to what the rival had actually done. It was something they called an unarmed heart, a heart that has simply stopped supplying its enemies with anything to fight against, regardless of how much provocation continues to arrive. An enemy given resentment is handed ammunition and knows exactly how to use it. An enemy given nothing but steady goodwill is left, quite suddenly, with no battle left to wage, and often no idea what to do next except stop. Neither tradition asked its students to feel warmth they did not genuinely have, since a performed kindness is usually recognized for what it is and rarely disarms anything. What was asked instead was smaller, and in its own way harder: to withhold retaliation long enough for the pattern to break on its own, to answer provocation with the same steady conduct one would offer anyone else, whether or not any warmth was felt behind it that day. The warmth, both traditions taught, tends to arrive afterward once the old habit of keeping score has quietly stopped being fed. Chapter 8. The Star That Guided Without a Map. Long before instruments existed to chart a course, caravan guides crossing the great deserts relied on something the merchants called simply the pull, a felt sense, arriving without explanation, of which direction held safety and which direction held ruin.
One guide was hired by a wealthy trader who insisted on following the well-worn trade route marked on his charts, rather than the guide's suggested detour around a dry valley that added an extra day to the journey. The guide felt a strong unease about the marked route that night, though he could not explain none of it in terms the trader would accept. He held his tongue the first night, telling himself he was likely imagining it. By the second, the unease had grown too strong to ignore, and he insisted the caravan turn, against the trader's open irritation at the delay. The trader agreed only to keep the peace between them, muttering the whole while about lost time. They later learned that the marked route had been struck by a flash flood tearing through the valley floor that same week, the very kind that leaves no survivors among a caravan caught inside it when the walls close in. A second account tells of a temple physician in an ancient river city, known for diagnoses that seemed to arrive before any symptom had clearly appeared to anyone else in the room. Colleagues assumed she relied on some hidden method she simply refused to share with them. She always answered the same way when asked directly. She had simply learned early in her training to notice the faint impulse that arrived before her reasoning caught up with it, and to write that impulse down immediately, before talking herself out of it with more sensible-sounding explanations. The old teachers called this the oldest instrument of all, older than the compass, and, they insisted, considerably harder to ignore once a person had genuinely learned to listen for it rather than argue it away. They were careful, however, to distinguish the pull from mere impulse or passing whim. A whim announces itself loudly and fades quickly under the first question asked of it. The pull, by contrast, tends to be quiet, easily talked over, and strangely persistent, returning unchanged even after the reasoning mind believes it has successfully argued the matter shut. The guide who turned his caravan did not act on the first flicker of unease. He acted only once the same unease had survived 2 full nights of his own best arguments against it, which is precisely what separated it in his own account of the story from an ordinary passing worry. The old schools that trained such guides made a further distinction worth carrying forward between the pull and simple fear. Fear, they taught, tends to arrive loudest exactly when nothing is actually wrong, seizing on any uncertainty at all. The pull, by contrast, tends to arrive with an odd, quiet specificity, pointing toward one particular direction rather than simply away from discomfort in general. A frightened guide wants to stop moving altogether. A guide following the pull generally still wants to move, only differently than planned. What faint pull have you been talking yourself out of simply because it arrived without a tidy explanation attached to it?
Chapter 9. The Blueprint Hidden in the Stone. A stonecutter was assigned early in his apprenticeship to shape blocks for a temple wall. Steady, respectable, entirely unremarkable work that would occupy most of his working life if nothing ever changed. He performed it competently for years, though something in him remained restless, unexplained even to himself, a low, persistent sense that this could possibly not be the whole of what he was meant to do with his hands. One day, waiting for new blocks to arrive, he began absently shaping the offcuts into small figures, birds, animals, the faces of people he knew from the workshop. The master architect happened to pass and stopped,
silent for a long while, studying the small carvings scattered across the workbench. He was reassigned that week to carve the temple's ceremonial reliefs, work he had never been trained for and had never once requested from anyone. He excelled immediately, as though the skill had been waiting inside him the entire time, needing only permission and occasion to appear where anyone else could see it. A second account tells of a young woman raised to inherit her family's modest grain trade, dutiful and capable at it years without complaint, who was asked one evening by a traveling storyteller to help entertain restless children at an inn, with nothing more than her voice and an idle tale borrowed from memory. She discovered, to her own genuine surprise, a gift for holding a room's attention that she had simply never had occasion to test before that night. Within a few seasons, storytelling, not grain, had quietly become the center of her working life, and the trade she once assumed was her entire future became something she simply managed on the side, competently, but without any of the same hunger. The old teaching held that every person carries such a hidden design, not a career chosen by family or circumstance or convenience, but a shape of contribution meant for no one else in quite the same way. Most spend a lifetime cutting the assigned blocks, never once shaping the offcuts to see what waits, unrequested, inside their own hands. The question the old architects left behind was simple. What have you been shaping quietly, almost without permission, whenever no one important was watching closely enough to stop you? It is worth noting what neither story claimed. Neither the stone-cutter nor the young grain trader abandoned their assigned work overnight, nor were they told the assigned work had been worthless all along. The stone-cutter continued shaping ordinary blocks for a time, even after his reassignment became known, and the young woman managed her family's trade competently for years afterwards. The old teaching was never that the design replaces every other obligation the moment it is discovered. It was only that the design, once glimpsed, deserves the same patient attention a person already gives to the work assigned by someone else, rather than being dismissed as an idle distraction unworthy of serious time. There is a further caution the old architects added, worth carrying alongside the encouragement. Not every restless feeling points toward a hidden design, and the old teachers were quick to say so, since the teaching is easily used as an excuse for abandoning steady work at the first sign of boredom. What distinguished the true design in their account was its persistence, the way it kept quietly returning across years rather than flaring briefly and fading, and its quality, the way work done from it tended to draw others' notice unprompted, the way the master architect noticed the offcuts without being asked to look for anything at all. Chapter 10. The Grammar of Asking. Among the old teachers of sacred sound, a single mispronounced syllable in a mantra was considered enough to change its entire effect, not because the gods were petty or easily offended, but because sound itself was understood to carry exact instructions, and exact instructions must be given exactly if they are to be carried out exactly. A student once asked an old teacher for release from suffering, and received instead a long season of numbness in which nothing moved him, joy or sorrow alike, arriving and passing without any weight to either of them. Troubled by this strange flatness, he returned to his teacher, who asked him gently what he had actually requested. The student repeated his words exactly as he remembered saying them. The teacher smiled. "You asked to feel nothing at all. You should have asked to suffer no longer while still feeling everything else fully." A second account, from a very different setting, describes a young trader who asked repeatedly over several years for enough money to stop worrying, and found oddly that whatever sum arrived, however large, the worry always returned within weeks, precisely as requested. Money had arrived exactly as asked, but he had never once specified an end to the worry itself, and so the worry simply continued alongside whatever new sum sat in his accounts. Only when he changed his request, asking plainly for a settled, unworried mind, regardless of the sum involved, did the worry actually begin to lift, even before any further money arrived at all. The teaching that followed from both accounts was precise. The old understanding held that intention alone does not fill the gaps of a poorly finished sentence with whatever you probably meant. It answers the words as given, exactly as given. A vague request receives a vague answer. An answer to a poorly finished sentence often finishes the sentence in ways the asker never intended and would never have chosen deliberately. The old instruction, then, was never simply to ask, but to ask with the same care a jeweler gives to cutting a stone, nothing left rough, nothing left for chance to finish on its own uncertain terms. There is a further refinement worth adding, since it is easy to mistake precision for suspicion, as though the universe were a difficult clerk waiting for any excuse to deny a poorly filed request. The old teachers did not describe an adversarial universe at all. They described an exact one, closer to a well-tuned instrument than to a hostile judge, responding faithfully to whatever note is actually played upon it, sour or clear. A musician frustrated by a wrong note does not blame the instrument. She adjusts her fingers and plays it again, more carefully. The same patience, the old teachers said, belongs at the center of every request. Chapter 11. The Divine Selection. An old custom, once practiced in certain courts of ancient India, allowed a bride to walk a hall of assembled suitors and place a garland, unprompted, around the neck of the one she recognized as truly hers, rather than accept whichever match had simply been arranged for convenience or family advantage. There is a story of a young woman pressured for months to favor a wealthy suitor her family had already all but promised her to. She walked the hall as custom required, garland in hand, and found, to everyone's surprise but her own, that her feet simply would not stop at his place among the assembled men. She continued the length of the hall and placed the garland around a quieter, far less celebrated suitor standing near the end, a man she had barely spoken to before that day. Their household, against every prediction made about the match, became the most contented in the region within a few short years, while the wealthy suitor, married elsewhere soon after, found the arrangement far less satisfying than his family had promised him it would be. A second account, from the early Buddhist teaching stories, tells of a disciple who begged his teacher for the very next opening at a distant, celebrated monastery, certain it alone would bring him the peace he was searching for. The teacher refused to intervene on his behalf, telling him only that a right position accepted before it was ready would sit on a man the way a borrowed robe sits on the wrong shoulders. Tolerable, perhaps, but never truly settled. The disciple waited, reluctantly, and was offered a much smaller hermitage 2 seasons later, one he had never previously considered. It was there, and only there, that he finally found the stillness he had spent years chasing everywhere else. Both traditions insisted on the same distinction, easy to state and hard to practice. A request made for any available good is answered eventually with whatever happens to be available. A request made for the one that is genuinely fitting waits, sometimes uncomfortably, for the one that actually is. The old teachers never discouraged asking boldly. They only insisted on asking precisely, for the selection that belongs to a person by right fit, not merely the first substitute that happens to present itself while the true one is still finding its way. This teaching was never offered as comfort for standing still. Both traditions expected active searching, real effort, a willingness to walk the entire hall rather than settle at the first suitor out of impatience with the walk itself. What they cautioned against was something narrower and more specific, the particular grief of forcing a fit that plainly is not one, simply because waiting any longer felt unbearable. A borrowed robe worn long enough out of impatience can start to feel almost like one's own. The old teachers insisted it never quite becomes one, no matter how long it is worn. There is a further nuance the old teachers were careful to preserve, since the teaching can otherwise curdle into passivity dressed up as discernment. Waiting for the right selection was never meant to excuse indefinite delay disguised as pickiness. The young woman still walked the entire hall. She did not refuse to walk it at all. The disciple still asked, plainly and directly, for the post he wanted. He did not simply retreat into silence and call it patience. The discipline asked of both was to keep searching honestly, while refusing only the substitute that plainly did not fit, not to use the teaching as cover for never searching, asking, or choosing at all. Chapter 12. The Cup Overflowing. Among the wandering teachers of the old alms traditions, there was a beggar known throughout several towns, not for what he lacked, which was nearly everything by ordinary measure, but for the unusual habit he kept each evening of naming aloud, to no one in particular, 3 things he had been given that day, however small. Some evenings it was little more than a kind word from a stranger, or a scrap of bread offered without being asked. He named these aloud anyway, with the same evident thanks he might have given for a far greater gift. Townspeople who witnessed the habit for years noticed something they could not quite explain, that his portion, modest as it remained, never seemed to run out entirely, while other beggars in the same district, no less deserving, went through far leaner seasons. When a younger beggar asked him directly why he bothered thanking anyone for so little, He replied that a cup held out with resentment at its smallness tends to stay small, while a cup held out with genuine thanks for whatever fills it seems, by some logic he could not quite explain, to keep finding its way toward being filled again. The Stoic teachers, in their own separate tradition, gave their students a related exercise, instructing them to spend part of each evening naming plainly what they already possessed, rather than what they still lacked, on the reasoning that a mind trained to notice absence will keep noticing absence no matter how much arrives, while a mind trained to notice sufficiency begins to notice sufficiency everywhere it looks, including in places it had previously overlooked entirely. This was never offered as a technique for manufacturing false contentment in a genuinely desperate situation. It was offered as a corrective to a much more common and much more quiet problem, a mind so occupied with counting its shortages that it has stopped noticing its own resources long enough to use them, share them, or even simply enjoy them while they last. There is a further piece of the old teaching worth adding, since the exercise can otherwise be mistaken for simple positive thinking. The beggar did not deny his hunger on the nights it went unanswered, and the Stoic student was never asked to pretend a genuine loss was secretly a gift. What both traditions insisted on was narrower and more exact, that gratitude and hardship are entirely capable of sitting in the same evening together, and that naming what remains does not erase what is missing. It simply keeps a person from losing sight of the second thing while drowning in the first.
Chapter 13. The Discipline of Expecting. A merchant, expecting a harvest still weeks from ripening, was mocked openly by his neighbors for having his scales, his ledgers, and his storehouse already prepared, as though the grain had already arrived at his door. "You were preparing for a harvest that does not yet exist," they told him, not unkindly, simply baffled by the effort spent on something so far off. He answered that a harvest arriving to an unprepared house is very often wasted before it can even be properly counted, weighed, or stored, no matter how abundant it turns out to be. A second story tells of a young craftsman who needed steady commissions to support his growing household, and who, rather than waiting anxiously for orders to appear on their own, began each week setting aside his best tools, cleaning his workshop thoroughly, and pricing materials as though the next commission were already confirmed and simply awaiting his readiness. Neighbors thought this presumptuous, given how little work had actually come his way that particular season. Within a month, 3 separate commissions arrived in the same week, and he was, unlike others caught unprepared by the sudden demand, entirely ready to begin at once, tools sharpened and workshop clear. The old Stoic teachers practiced something similar in the mind rather than in the storehouse, rehearsing difficulty before it arrived so it would find them steady, and rehearsing good fortune as well, so that neither extreme would find them entirely unprepared to receive it fully when it finally came. A related custom kept among certain Hindu households awaiting a long-hoped-for occasion, a marriage, a birth, a homecoming, involved preparing a small measure of the celebration in advance, a garland strung early, a lamp filled and ready, well before there was any certainty the occasion would actually arrive on schedule. Elders who kept this custom explained it plainly to the young. Readiness prepared only after certainty arrives is not readiness at all.
It is simply a reaction, arriving exactly as late as the news that prompted it. Expectation in this old teaching was never simply hope held passively at a distance. It was hope that had already begun doing the small, unglamorous work of getting ready, long before there was any proof the readiness would be rewarded. There is an obvious risk in this teaching, one the old philosophers addressed directly rather than skirting around. Prepare for a harvest that never comes, and the preparation looks, in hindsight, like foolishness. The old answer was not to deny the risk, but to reframe what the preparation was actually for. The merchant, with his scales already set, did not lose the exercise even in a season of failed crops, since the discipline of readiness itself, practiced enough times, becomes a settled habit of mind that serves every future harvest, not merely the one currently being awaited. Chapter 14. The Mirror Beneath Still Water. An old teaching describes a still pool beside a mountain path, said to reflect back the exact temperament of whoever leaned over it to look at. Nothing added, nothing softened. A traveler in a foul mood once accused the pool of showing him a scowling, unpleasant face, and cursed it loudly for the insult, certain the water itself had wronged him somehow. A second traveler, arriving calm and unhurried not long after, leaned over the very same water and found only a calm and unhurried face looking back at him, exactly as untroubled as he was. Villagers nearby, who had heard both men's complaints over the years, eventually stopped discussing the pool altogether among themselves. They had realized, quietly and without needing to say it aloud, that it had never shown anyone anything but themselves. A second account from the same region tells of a household plagued for years by a servant everyone agreed was hopelessly surly and difficult to work alongside, until a new mistress of the house arrived, treated the same servant with unwavering patience and warmth for a single season, and watched the very same person become, by every account, the gentlest presence in the entire household. Nothing about the servant's circumstances had changed in that time. Only the face leaning over the water had changed. The old Taoist teachers extended this observation further still. Illness, misfortune, and even the behavior of those around a person were often, they taught, simply the still water doing what still water always does, not causing the disturbance itself, only reflecting it back with total and unflinching accuracy. This was never offered as blame directed at the one looking into the water. It was offered as instruction. Change what leans over the water, and the water has no remaining choice but to change its face in return. The old teachers were careful to add one further clarification, since the teaching is easily twisted into something crueler than intended. They did not claim every misfortune belongs entirely to the one who suffers it, nor did they excuse genuine wrongdoing done by others. What they pointed to was narrower and more useful: the surprising number of ordinary daily frictions, a curt reply, a cold reception, a colleague's short temper, that soften or vanish entirely the moment the person facing them stops leaning over the water with the same tension they are quietly hoping not to see reflected back. There is a further version of this teaching, kept among households rather than travelers, that extended the mirror from a single pool to an entire home. A house entered warily, the old teachers said, tends to answer warily, its occupants growing quietly guarded around a guest who arrives already braced for coldness. A house entered with open, unhurried warmth tends, just as reliably, to answer in kind, not because the house itself has any will of its own, but because the guest's own posture shapes, more than anyone likes to admit, exactly what kind of welcome he ends up receiving from it. Chapter 15. The Illness Named Resentment. The old temple physicians of the Nile kept records, alongside their remedies of herb and mineral, of a second and stranger kind of diagnosis, one that asked not only what a patient had eaten or breathed, but what a patient had been carrying silently in the heart for months or years beforehand. There is an account of a craftsman who suffered for years from a stiffness in his joints that no poultice or remedy seemed to touch for long. A visiting physician, after the usual questions produced nothing useful, asked him instead who he had not yet forgiven. The craftsman, startled by the question, admitted after some silence that he had never once forgiven a business partner who had cheated him out of a fair share years earlier, and thought of the man bitterly almost every day since. The physician prescribed no herb for this. He prescribed instead a single visit to make peace with the matter, however the craftsman saw fit to do it. The stiffness, though never entirely gone, eased noticeably within the season that followed. The healers of the Ayurvedic tradition, developing their own detailed science of the body along the banks of a different river, arrived at a strikingly similar principle, teaching that unexpressed anger settles in the body's tissues the way silt settles in a still pond, and that no remedy fully clears what an unaddressed grievance keeps quietly refilling. Modern medicine, in its own more recent language, has begun mapping some of the same terrain, describing how sustained resentment and unresolved stress correspond to measurable strain on the body over time. The old teachers had no instruments for measuring this directly. They simply watched patiently over generations of patients and recorded what they saw returning again and again in those who carried old grievances the longest. None of this was meant to suggest that illness is always, or even usually, a simple mirror of an unresolved grudge. The old physicians treated fevers as fevers and wounds as wounds. What they added was a second question, asked alongside the first, for the cases the usual remedies failed to reach. What has this person been tarrying, unaddressed, for far longer than they realized? There is a further account, preserved among the same temple records, of a woman whose recurring headaches vanished entirely within days of reconciling with a sister she had not spoken to in years, though no remedy tried previously had touched the condition at all. The physician who recorded the case was careful to note that he could not explain the mechanism, only the pattern, and the pattern, repeated across enough patients over enough years, was difficult for the old temple schools to dismiss as simple coincidence. The Ayurvedic physicians kept a related distinction that later students of the mind would arrive at independently, describing certain conditions as carrying a visible cause, a wound, a fever, a broken bone, and others as carrying what they called a hidden root, a condition whose visible symptom was simply the last, most obvious link in a much longer chain that began somewhere in the emotions long before it ever reached the body at all. Treating only the visible link, they taught, brought relief that rarely lasted, while treating the hidden root, however much harder to locate, tended to resolve both the symptom and its tendency to return. Chapter 16. The Guest Who Was Never Turned Away. Among the oldest laws recorded in the river cities of Sumer and its neighboring kingdoms was a strict and closely guarded duty of hospitality, that any traveler arriving at a door, however unexpected, however poor, was to be fed, sheltered, and sent on his way with something in hand, never turned away empty for lack of welcome. There is an old account of a household that violated this law out of simple stinginess, refusing shelter to a ragged traveler on a bitter night because feeding him seemed at the time an unnecessary expense. Word of the refusal spread through the district, as such things tended to, and the household found itself quietly excluded from trade agreements and marriage arrangements for years afterward, its name synonymous with a closed door long after anyone remembered the traveler's face. A second account describes a woman known throughout her town for her poverty, who nonetheless never once refused a gift offered to her, however small, insisting always on receiving it graciously, rather than protesting that she did not need it or did not deserve it. Neighbors, puzzled by her comparative good fortune despite her modest means, eventually noticed that gifts, invitations, and opportunities seemed to find their way to her door far more readily to households of considerably greater wealth, who were known instead for waving away whatever was offered them out of pride. The old teaching drawn from both accounts ran in two directions at once, rarely separated in the original telling. A household that gives freely, the elders said, keeps its own door open in a way that cannot be easily explained by ledgers alone. And a person who receives gracefully, rather than deflecting every kindness out of false modesty or discomfort, keeps that same door open from the other side. Refusing a gift, in this old understanding, was not humility, it was simply another way of closing a door that the giving and receiving of life depends on keeping open in both directions. The old law made no exception for households that felt they had little to spare, and this was considered the whole point rather than an oversight. It was precisely the household counting its own scarcity most anxiously that the law asked to open its door anyway, on the reasoning that a door closed out of fear of scarcity tends to keep the scarcity firmly in place, while a door kept open, even nervously, tends to let both kinds of traffic through, what leaves and what eventually returns. There is a further detail preserved in the old codes worth noting, since it is easy to imagine the custom applied only to travelers passing through. The same law governed how a household received good fortune arriving at its own door, an unexpected gift, an offer of help, an unearned kindness. To wave it away out of pride or discomfort was treated under the same principle as a kind of door closed just as firmly as refusing a hungry traveler, since both, in the old understanding, were simply different ways of declining what had been sent. Chapter 17. The Room Swept Clean. An old household custom, observed across many of the river cities of the ancient world, held that a home left cluttered, dusty, or in quiet disrepair would, sooner or later, attract a fortune that matched it, however hard its occupants worked outside its walls. There is an account of a merchant's wife who took pride in her trade dealings, but let the household itself fall into a kind of comfortable disorder, drawers left open, tools misplaced, mended things never quite finished. Guests were fond of her, but noted privately that her family's fortunes never seemed to grow no matter how favorable her trades appeared to be on paper. An elder, visiting one afternoon, remarked only that a house asking abundance to arrive, while it could not even keep its own drawers in order, was asking two contradictory things of the world at once. She began, without real conviction at first, simply closing drawers, mending what had been left half-finished for months, clearing the single cluttered room she had long since stopped noticing at all. Within the same season, 2 long-stalled trade agreements resolved suddenly in her family's favor, for reasons she could never quite trace back to the tidying itself, though she never again let the house slide back into its old disorder. A second account, from a very different setting, tells of a young scholar convinced his cramped, chaotic study was simply the price of serious work, and mocked the notion that a swept floor could have any bearing on the clarity of his thinking. Forced by illness to keep to his bed for several weeks, he had a servant clear and order the room around him, out of necessity rather than conviction. He remarked afterward, almost embarrassed by the admission, that his thinking on returning to his desk felt noticeably clearer in that newly ordered space, though he could offer no explanation beyond the room itself no longer quietly demanding a portion of his attention every time he glanced around it. The old teaching drawn from both accounts was simple and stated without embellishment. A mind that tolerates disorder in what it can see every day rarely notices it has grown equally tolerant of disorder in what it cannot see at all. Its own expectations, its own habits, its own quiet neglect. Order, in this understanding, was never mere tidiness. It was a small, visible rehearsal of the order being asked for everywhere else. This was never meant as a demand for spotlessness, and the old teachers were quick to say so whenever the point was misunderstood. A working household, a working workshop, a working mind all carry a certain amount of honest clutter simply from being used. The distinction drawn was between clutter that comes from active use and disorder that has quietly been given up on. The drawer no longer even noticed as chaotic, the habit no longer even registered as broken. It was that second, invisible kind of surrender the old teaching asked its students to keep watching for. Chapter 18. The Ledger That Cannot Lie. In the oldest counting houses of Sumer, a merchant's fortune was judged less by what sat locked away in his storehouse, and more by how cleanly his ledgers moved, grain going out at fair measure, grain coming in at fair measure, nothing left to rot quietly in a forgotten corner, while accounts elsewhere went unsettled for months at a time. There is an account of 2 merchants trading the same goods in the same season under the same market conditions. One kept meticulous order, every jar labeled clearly, every debt recorded and promptly settled, every surplus put back into circulation through trade or gift, rather than left to sit in a forgotten corner. The other let his storehouse fall into disarray, hoarded whatever surplus came his way out of a vague sense of caution, and delayed his debts whenever it suited him to do so. Within a few seasons, the orderly merchant's trade had grown considerably, drawing new partners who trusted his clean, legible accounts on sight. The disorderly merchant found his goods spoiling in the confusion of his own storehouse, and his creditors, in time, unwilling to extend him further trust of any kind. A second account tells of a wealthy household known throughout the city for the sheer volume of goods stored away in its cellars: cloth, grain, tools, ornaments, most of it never used, most of it simply accumulating in the dark year after year. When a sudden misfortune required the household to raise funds quickly, they discovered that a great deal of the cloth had rotted beyond use, several tools had rusted past repair, and the ornaments, unworn and unadmired for years, fetched barely a fraction of their original worth once finally sold. A far more modest household nearby, which kept considerably less but circulated everything it owned promptly and kept careful account of it, weathered the very same misfortune with comparative ease. The old teaching drawn from both stories was not really about wealth itself. It was about circulation. A ledger that only receives and never releases eventually chokes quietly on its own hoarding, however full it appears from the outside. A ledger kept clean and moving draws more into its circuit, the way a river draws more water, the wider and clearer its channel is allowed to run. The old temple economies extended this principle formally, setting aside a fixed portion of every harvest and every trade to be given back into the wider community, rather than kept in private storehouses at all. This was rarely framed as charity in the way the word is used today. It was framed as maintenance, the same unglamorous upkeep a canal requires if it is to keep carrying water at all. A canal never cleared eventually silts over and stops moving water altogether, regardless of how full the reservoir feeding it remains. The old accountants understood their ledgers as such channels, to be kept clear, not vaults to be kept sealed. Chapter 19. The Archer's Stillness. Among the old teaching schools of the East, there is an account of two archers competing for a single honored post in the royal guard, both equally trained, both equally accurate, on a calm afternoon with nothing at stake. On the day of the true test, before a restless crowd and a nervous panel of judges, the first archer's hands trembled visibly as he drew his bow, his mind already racing ahead to the shame of missing in front of so many witnesses. His shot went wide. The second archer stood, by every outward account, exactly as still as he had on any ordinary training morning, his attention resting entirely on the single motion in front of him, rather than on the crowd, the judges, or the honor waiting on the far side of a successful shot. His arrow found its mark cleanly. Asked afterward how he had managed such calm under such pressure, the second archer said only that he had trained himself for years to treat every shot exactly the same, regardless of what happened to be riding on it, since the bow itself could not tell the difference between a target that mattered and one that did not, and neither, with enough practice, could his hand. The Stoic teachers described this same quality by a different name, calling it the still center from which right action naturally proceeds once fear and desire have stopped clouding the aim. They taught that a mind agitated by hope of reward or dread of failure shoots worse, not better, no matter how skilled the hand behind it, and that the discipline worth cultivating was never really about the target at all. It was about the steadiness of the archer, cultivated privately, long before any crowd ever gathered to watch the shot. This steadiness in both traditions was never described as indifference to the outcome. The second archer wanted the post as much as the first. What separated them was not the wanting, but where each man had chosen to place his attention in the moment the arrow actually left the bow. There is a further piece of the old teaching passed down among the archery schools, alongside the story itself. Students were warned against a particular trap: the temptation to judge each morning's practice by whether the arrow struck true, rather than by whether the stillness had been genuinely present in the drawing of the bow. An archer chasing results directly, they taught, tends to grow more anxious with every miss and more complacent with every hit, buffeted in both directions by something outside his control. An archer attending only to the stillness of the draw finds that the results over enough mornings tend to arrive on their own, as an almost incidental byproduct of the thing actually being practiced. Chapter 20. The Eternal Now. Each morning before dawn, an old monk raked the gravel garden behind his temple into careful, even lines, exactly as he had done every morning as long as anyone could remember. By evening, wind or footsteps or falling leaves had always undone his work completely, leaving no trace of the pattern he had drawn so carefully only hours before. A visiting student once asked why he bothered at all if the pattern never lasted through even a single full day. The monk answered that the raking was never meant to last. It was meant to be done again, fully, each morning, exactly as if it had never been done before and never would be again. The student pressed further, unsatisfied. Did this not feel like an endless, pointless repetition, the same task undone and redone, without any real progress to show for it? The monk said the opposite was true. It was the only task in his entire day that asked nothing of yesterday's garden and nothing of tomorrow's weather. It asked only for this morning's rake, drawn with this morning's attention, and nothing more than that. A second account tells of an old fisherman, well known along his stretch of river, who never once planned his work beyond the day immediately in front of him. He sold his morning's catch, mended what needed mending by evening, and slept without a single thought spent on tomorrow's weather or yesterday's poorer catch. Younger fishermen, anxious about the season ahead, thought him careless. He simply replied that a river only ever offers one day's fish at a time, and a man arguing with it about yesterday's or tomorrow's supply was arguing with a river that was not listening. Grief over yesterday's uneven lines, or worry over this evening's wind, the monk said, was the only thing that ever made the raking feel heavy at all. The raking itself never was, and never had been. This, the old teacher said, is the whole of the present moment's secret. It is not effortless because nothing happens within it. It is effortless because nothing from outside it is allowed to lean on it uninvited, weighing down a morning that was only ever asked to hold itself. None of this was offered as an argument against planning altogether, and both the monk and the fisherman kept perfectly sensible provisions for the seasons ahead: tools mended, nets repaired, stores set aside at the proper time. The distinction the old teachers drew was a narrower one, between the ordinary, useful work of preparing for tomorrow and the far heavier, entirely useless work of living inside a tomorrow that has not yet arrived, while the actual day in front of a person passes mostly unattended. A further account, told among the same river communities, describes an old woman asked by her grandchildren why she never seemed to worry the way other elders did about the years she had left. She answered that she had simply noticed over a long life that worry about tomorrow never once bought her a single extra day, while attention given fully to today had on more occasions than she could count made the day considerably better than it would have been otherwise. She saw no reason, she said, to keep paying a price that had never once purchased anything in return. Picture for a moment a great hall lined with lanterns from every corner of the ancient world. Egyptian oil lamps, Sumerian clay lights, Hindu diyas, Buddhist candle wicks, Taoist paper lanterns, the modest stone lamps of the Stoic portico, and near the far end of the hall, a single small flame, kept once through a long desert night by an early Christian hermit, alone with the same discovery in a different tongue. Each lantern was lit in a different century, by a different hand, in a different tongue, none of them aware the others existed at all. And yet, look closely at the flame inside each one. It is the same flame. The scribe's weaver, the Sumerian word, the reed that would not break, the wheel that remembers, the yoke set down at the threshold, the lion that was never there, the unarmed heart, the star that guided without a map, the blueprint hidden in the stone, the grammar of a careful request, the selection that must be right and not merely convenient, the cup that overflows for the one who names it full, the discipline of expecting, the mirror beneath still water, the illness named resentment, the guest never turned away, the room swept clean, the ledger kept clean, the archer's stillness, the garden raked new each morning. 20 lanterns, one flame passed silently across them by centuries that never touched. The old teachers, separated by oceans and centuries who could never have read one another's words, kept arriving again and again at the same small, unglamorous instruction. The outer life is governed by the inner one, and the inner one is governed by whoever is quietly minding it, whether they know they are doing so or not. You have been minding yours the entire time you listened to this, whether walking, driving, working, or simply resting somewhere quiet. The only question the old teachers left behind is whether you will keep minding it by accident or begin minding it on purpose, starting with whatever you carry into tomorrow morning. Master the flame within the lantern, and it no longer matters in the end which lantern you happen to be given to carry.